Welcome to Meadowlarkers 26, The Villains. I'm Howard Bryant. Amin Elhassan and Kate Fagan will be along in a moment, but first, some thoughts. The college basketball season is over. The dreaded UConn, once 11-0 in championship finals, has finally been defeated. Thoroughly dominated by South Carolina in the finale. Duke's last stand stopped in the Final Four. Mike Krzyzewski's career ended, not once, but twice, by North Carolina. If there was a common theme throughout the tournament, it was in the recognition that as many supporters as both of these programs have, just as many were gleeful in their defeats. Which brings us to today's topic. What makes a villain? Are they a wonderfully necessary component to the story we love to follow every year in the standings? Do these dynasties represent the inherent unfairness in sports, masquerading as excellence? Or are we the problem, the greatness of them bringing out the worst in us? Certainly, Coach K and Gino Auriemma have received overwhelming accolades throughout the decades. But they also brought out a certain nastiness in the fan bases that sometimes went beyond winning and losing. The phenomenon, of course, is not relegated to college basketball. Polarizing figures were everywhere. During the tournament and the run-up to it, Tom Brady unretired, to the groans of many who finally thought they were free of him. The Los Angeles Lakers have been bottoming out, and the joyless Brooklyn Nets received a lifeline from New York City Mayor Eric Adams, lifting vax restrictions that have prohibited Kyrie Irving from playing home games this year, just in time for the Nets to make a title run. Some of the hate toward these teams is simply a matter of success, like vitriol toward the old generational dream killers, the Montreal Canadiens and the New York Yankees, the Boston Celtics, and the Lakers. This season, however, the towering pillars of both men's and women's sports were facing a reckoning and a certain comeuppance, the end of the Coach K era, and the strange acceptance, despite a 25th 30-win season, that UConn were actually underdogs once they reached the Final Four. For the field, the UConn women have been blocking the sun for decades. They entered this season 239-0 against unranked opponents. Georgia Tech snapped that streak. Villanova broke UConn's 145-game conference winning streak. UConn even lost 5 whole times this season. That hadn't happened since the 2004-2005 season. Still, I tend to think it's not only about winning, or even longevity, because there have been several great teams that were not particularly polarizing on their way to the title. People got tired of Wooden's UCLA teams winning all the time, but the Bruins weren't loathed. The same was true of Don Shula's Dolphins. The Jim Calhoun, Kevin Ollie UConn men were excellent. They were feared, but they weren't hated. If you rooted for UConn, you probably didn't love Stanford, but no one was openly rooting for one more time. 1, 2, 3. If you rooted for the UConn women, you probably didn't love Stanford, but no one was openly rooting for Tara Vanderveer to lose with the lust of a Duke or the Dallas Cowboys or Auriemma's Huskies. Tara has been around just as long as Gino, and Stanford has the same snotty rich kid stench as Duke. Now, the New England Patriots, we get that one. Any franchise that prints "they hate us because they ain't us" t-shirts is leaning fully into the heel turn. No mystery there. And with that, we take on the simple question: why are the villains so special? Do we hate them because we need them? And are we going to miss them when they're gone? Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Meadowlarkers. We are at, what number is this? 26?
26 sounds right.
26, half a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Time flies.
Half a year. And in this half year, we have dethroned champions. We say goodbye to Coach K. We talked about this already in the intro. A lot of lust for the end of the Duke regime. I mean, a lot.
Yep.
Kind of beyond, right? I didn't hear as much when South Carolina beat UConn, but I didn't feel a lot of love there either. It was sort of interesting watching the way UConn sort of turned into underdogs, even though they had 30 wins this year. But What do you make, Kate Fagan, of the villain role? It doesn't belong to everybody just for winning, but there are certain teams that do get that. They get the bullseye.
Yeah.
And UConn do absolutely the top two this year.
Yeah. It's almost as if we need to distinguish between, and there's more than two, but let's say two kinds of villains. Mm-hmm. And one is the kind of villain who is purposefully constructing themselves as a villain. The kind of, let's
Oakland
use the
Raiders.
Or like the Detroit Pistons, the bad boy Detroit Pistons, where they are being a style of play, or if we're just talking in everyday life, like a contrarianism that is being adopted that is going against the grain, and it's all purposeful. And then there's the second kind of villain, and I would say that I think Duke and UConn more so fall into this second category, which is kind of the tall poppy syndrome, right? Which is like, and that's like an Australian, New Zealand term of like, you'll get it because it's universal and it goes back to like all of human history, like our desperate need as people to cut down anything that gets too tall. You are blocking out the sun for me. And this is like a New Zealand term, like tall poppy syndrome. We got to cut you down if you get too big.
You brought down to size.
Exactly. And, obviously the Japanese kind of proverb for that would be like, the nail sticking out gets the hammer kind of vibe. So I feel like Duke and UConn fall into that separate category. It's like almost like an evolutionary villain that over time, because they have come to embody because I do think both of them have embodied a time period in their respective sports. And because of that, they have taken on a lot of the best qualities of that time period and also the excess and the worst qualities of that time period as well.
I think about it as there's two types of villains. One is what you described, the black hat, right? He's the guy rides into town, wrestling up cattle, shooting up the town folk, going in the bar, running up a tab, throwing bottles around. No one wants to mess with him, right? That's like Detroit. That's like the Raiders. And then you have a villain from a different genre of movie. Not a Western, but from a teen drama at the high school. He's the captain of the football team. He drives a convertible somehow, even though he's in high school. He gets straight A's. And we all know, without there being any sort of kind of obvious...
The privileged rich kid.
Exactly. Without there being something obvious character flaw-wise of crime or aggression, we just know, don't like that guy. We're not rooting for him. That's what Duke is. That's what UConn is. Bomani said it really well on his show, on the first episode of his show. He talked about it wasn't because they were great. It's because they're great and there's a level of better than you, right? Not better than you.
Smarmy rich kid.
Oh, yeah.
Snotty rich kid.
Which, of course, was the great, dichotomy or hypocrisy of Christian Laettner looking like that guy, despite coming from a very kind of blue-collar Buffalo, New York background.
Yeah, it's interesting because to me, all of this talk really does stem from the growing of the sport, the growing of the game, and every sport has them. And for me, I'm a dynasty guy. I will tell you, one thing Kate always says on this show is we're here for story. Part of the narrative of sports, to me, is always having that team that you circle. Sometimes, if you're lucky, if you grow up like I did, you grow up in Boston, you're the team. The Boston Celtics were the team that you circled, right? Everybody wanted to take down the Celtics. Other times, if you're unlucky, like me, and you grow up in Boston, and the Montreal Canadiens are the team that you circle, and they beat your ass every single year. But the dynasty is what grows the sport. And in women's sports, it was UConn. When I was a kid, and they only showed women's basketball once a year, and it was the Final Four, it was always Louisiana Tech. It was Louisiana Tech, and it was Kim Mulkey's team. It was the McGee sisters.
And it was like Cheryl Miller at USC.
Exactly, but they weren't. But they didn't take the space that UConn would take. And UConn took a space that wasn't even just villainy. It was, you are bad for this sport. This, and it was so ahistorical to me because every single sport has had the one dominant team that everybody has to deal with, whether you're the Green Bay Packers, if you're the Montreal Canadiens from 1930 to 1979, the Canadiens in 49 years, they won 20 Stanley Cups. The Celtics won 16 titles in 30 years. The Lakers, 1980 to 2010, they won 16. They went to the finals 16 times. They won 10 titles. The Yankees, 1921 to 1964, they won 20 titles, and they went to the World Series 28 times. And so all of these sports have them, but when it came to UConn, it was, you're not good for the game.
But I think we've had that conversation. I think that's not a function of the sport or who's doing it. I think it's a function of recency, because we've had that conversation about Michael Jordan. Were the Bulls bad for basketball? And when Michael Jordan retired, are the ratings tanking because everyone made everything about Michael Jordan? We've had that conversation about the Golden State Warriors. In the moment, the idea that the best team in the league could add the best player in the league, it shook people's kind of faith in the sport, kind of. The Cowboys, also in the early 90s, there was that. But the reality is this: whenever you get people railing against, are these people good for the sport? Inevitably what happens is they are the best thing for the sport for two reasons. From a business standpoint, viewers, broadcasters, whoever you want to pick on, or sponsors, they're all attracted to this property because everyone else is attracted to the property for one of two reasons. Either because I love them or because I want to see them fail, right?
The polarizing works.
Absolutely. There's no one who kind of had like, I don't have an opinion either way about Derek Jeter. Like, you either loved him or you hated him. And
that's not actually true. I mean, because there are teams, and that's why villains are so important. It's not just success. There are teams that win all the time that people don't really hate. They don't love them, but they don't really hate them. I mean, did anybody really hate the San Antonio Spurs unless you were a Laker fan or a Suns fan? They won 5 titles. People said they were boring, but they weren't in the Duke, Lakers, Celtics category, and neither were the UConn men. UConn men were a really good team, but nobody...
Might be hard for me to separate. When I think of San Antonio, they play in the AT&T Center. They literally have a Death Star. They play at the Death Star. They are the evil empire.
But even if you take yourself out of it, would you say the San Antonio Spurs were one of the hated teams in America? They weren't.
Not one of the most hated, no. But also they didn't have the continuous. See, I think one of the things that needs to happen for this is the continuous success. You can't take years off in between, even as we acknowledge there's sustained excellence in terms of 50-win seasons and going to playoffs every year and all that stuff. But not having back-to-back victories, that kind of automatically took them out of a conversation.
And they only went to back-to-back finals twice, right? I think twice.
And they also didn't have an association with an entity that seemingly gives them privilege. So it's, like even a city, let's say, right? Like where the Yankees are hated to another level for various reasons, but also because they're from New York City, right? A city that considers itself like the greatest in the world. And I think then there's as someone who now lives in the South, there's certainly a point of view where it's like, oh, that's, there's the urban versus rural when it comes to that. And even if you look at UConn, there's the direct association with ESPN that gives them a level of privilege. And San Antonio never quite had that. Even though they were winners, they were always like, nothing. It always felt, whether it's right or not, nothing was handed to them. They drafted somebody at 28 and they turned into a superstar. Nothing seemed unfair about the San Antonio Spurs.
Yeah, let's stay on that. And Kate, tell me about the ESPN bias piece of the UConn theory. I want to hear this.
Well, yeah, because I think when it comes to just the UConn conversation, I think it has evolved away from, like, are they good for the game? And I think what you're seeing over the last year is a more nuanced question about how do you break the UConn dynasty when they're a rolling snowball that gets so much of everything, including, like we talked about, home seed and home court through to the Final Four in a way that other teams might not. So I think, and this is the UConn piece as it relates to ESPN is an interesting one, as everyone here has worked at ESPN. there is a level of coverage that UConn gets, and I don't mean like broadcasting their games, but even like the most nuanced thing, if you were paying attention to the championship game against South Carolina, there were 8 WNBA players in attendance in that game in various parts of the arena, right? Like Asia Wilson was there, Candace Parker was there, Lasia Clarendon was there. There was like 4 or 5 others. In a men's broadcast of a final, I can't imagine that a broadcast would go through where they wouldn't spotlight, oh, look, Wake Forest is playing and Chris Paul is here, or LeBron's in attendance and Kevin Durant's in attendance. Let's show the 8 NBA stars who are watching the up-and-coming future of their game. But if you peel back on that ESPN broadcast, they never once highlighted any of the other players in attendance. But on ESPN2, there was a broadcast that was going on that was being done by Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi, and the game call.
Where they go to school?
UConn. And the game call, thanks, Amin. And the game call, one half of the game call is Rebecca Lobo. So it's like these small things where it's like, we're not even showing airtime. And I'm not saying this was something that ESPN did with sinister underpinnings. It simply probably never occurred to them to flash these other people on the screen. So you get to this place where it's like I think the UConn dynasty, the way it is right now, can only happen in women's sports because of these underpinning issues, which is that if you were, let's take this example. If you're a high school star coming out of and deciding where to go to school, you pretty much know if you're good enough, you can go anywhere and you're going to get covered, right? You could go to pick random mid-level, Duquesne, and you're like, if you're a big-time star, that spotlight is finding you. If you're a women's star and it's getting better, you have this one captured moment because the attention that's put on women's basketball is only bright. It's getting brighter for the WNBA, but for the most part, like those 4 years were the spotlight. So you have to say to yourself, can I really go somewhere else if I want to make as much of an impact as I can? So I think UConn is a uniquely interesting proposition because of the gender underpinnings of it.
You get knighted.
Go ahead,
No, I say you get knighted by going to UConn. Now I think about it, I wish we had Renee Montgomery on here.
I've asked her about this, yeah.
I remember we had her on a podcast a while ago. By the way, a lot of the stuff that that Kate's talking about. People said basketball Illuminati. We got into some of that stuff, the intricate connection between UConn and ESPN. But again, I remember talking to Renee about what were the other offers out there. And it's one of those things where, when you get that call from Gino, from that staff, man, that's another level of this is how great you are.
It's the New York Yankees. It's the Boston Celtics. It's the biggest dog in your sport calling you, and it tells you that you've made it. Now, I'm sure that the Stanfords and the Tennessees and the Louisiana Techs and the rest of them were sort of like, well, wait a minute, we got a pretty good legacy here too. But nothing comes close to what Gino's done the last 30 years. Not even. They lost 8 games in 2005.
We
that's
joked
like
about
3 years worth for them.
We joked about this with Renee about the idea that I think she only went to the Final Four once in her 4 years, and in her sophomore year, I want to say. And I said there were teammates on your squad who were seniors who, if y'all didn't make it that year, they would have been the first UConn class to go 4 years and not go to a Final Four. Like, was there ever a desperation there? She's like, hell yeah! Like, no one wants to be remembered as the one who went to UConn and couldn't make it happen. And so, it's very real.
The villainy piece of it, though, which I find really interesting, especially with Duke, like the Coach K farewell really did bring this to light. And obviously the controversy of Coach K, and of course, I don't know if anyone saw, a lot of people saw both the Costas show on HBO and Bomani's Game Theory, where he was talking about the place of Duke and why there's a lot of, he's got the North Carolina thing going on as well, but there really is like a lot of different ways that you can fall into that villain category. And one of the ways that Duke falls into it is both race and class. That the argument Bomani was making, and there's a lot of truth to it, is that in the NBA, We saw this in the 80s, when as the game was getting darker and darker and darker, both complexion-wise, as the game was 80% black in the 80s, which it is now in the high 70s, and also culturally, there were white fans who were like, I don't find this accessible until I saw Larry Bird. Or until I see the Dirk Nowitzkis of the world, and then you find someone that looks like you that you feel like you can identify with. And that's a real thing. I mean, one of the things that when you talk about that from an NBA standpoint was there were Celtics fans across the country who had nothing to do with the city of Boston, wanted nothing to do with the Boston Celtics, but identified with them as the white team. And the Celtics were aware of that, and they knew it, and everybody knew it. And in 1986... the NBA is an 80% black league. The Celtics had 10 of 14 white players. That's really, really statistically hard to do. And so that makes you a villain, because then you watch a Spike Lee movie, the Celtics are essentially the epitome of they represent white supremacy. And it's like, well, wait a minute, as a black Bostonian, I'm like, well, we didn't see it that way. But when I was growing up there, absolutely, it was 100% there. Brothers looked at you like, you're rooting for the Celtics? And we were in Boston. Like, no, they were Philadelphia. Dr. J, Magic Johnson. The black Celtic fan in your own city was absolutely sort of a bit of an outcast. And in the college game, it's the same with Duke, that Duke represented something as the game was getting darker.
Bourgeoisie.
Where
Duke
people... Yep. And that's not something that you necessarily place on Duke, but it does add to the villainy. And you can add it to Duke if you believe they leaned into it.
They absolutely did. They absolutely did. And even when you listen to Coach K talk about the kind of players that they recruited, there's all sorts of coded language.
Direct Fab Five shot there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, they leaned into it. And I think every villain is complicit in some way with their villainy. Whether they are like the popular jock big man on campus, or they're the black hat in the cowboy movie, they all play a role in their villainy. Some of it is nothing more than, hey, man, we're just really good. But they also play up the stuff that you don't like because they know you don't like it. Yeah.
I think there's in asking this question, Howard, of like what the categories and the layers of villainy are. I mean, one of them with Duke, that you just perfectly articulated. There's something in addition baked into that, which is that in sports, we obviously want, although on the show we often talk about how it's not true or doesn't happen, we want meritocracy. We want an even playing field. And when we have teams like Duke or the Yankees, or name any of them, or UConn, we want at least that year's team to feel like it's on an even playing field against everyone else it's playing. But then you realize it's not.
No, we don't. We think we want those things.
Right.
Yeah, in policing,
obviously,
Kate,
yes.
In policing, the term is called implicit bias, where you don't want to admit it, but when you're walking down the street and you see a black guy, you initially think they're a criminal, whether you want to say it or whether you don't want to say it, right? That this is implicit in the way you're assessing certain people.
Yes.
And this is something that is very huge. It's a big, big piece of trying to find justice. I was watching the game this weekend, and it was reminding me of when I was covering the Oakland A's. Ken Maka used to say all the time, the toughest out in Major League Baseball is to get a called third strike in the ninth inning at Fenway Park or Yankee Stadium. That the umpires knew that they were not ringing you up in that place, which is the dynasty privilege. And when I was watching Duke Carolina, there was a part of me watching the game going, are they blowing the whistle more for Duke right now in the last 10 minutes of this game? Am I imagining this? Or are the same drives to the basket getting a little bit more dispensation as this game is starting to slip away from Duke? And I was like, I'm going to just watch this game again to see if I'm feeling this, or is it the Duke is a villain and now they're getting all the calls thing that we all start to think of? I couldn't quite tell, but that is also the villain component, as we see with Tom Brady, and you see it with all the, that something is going to go your way because you're getting the dynasty dispensation.
Right. Like ultimately that was, that's the point I'm trying to make, is simply that even if a villain isn't a villain, right? Like there is no Marvel moment where they have done something, but just rather be good for a long period of time. And I'm not talking about Duke here. I'm talking about UConn, because there is no villain turning point for UConn. There is no moment in time. There is no player. Do you have a moment where UConn?
I think it's Gino himself.
Gino's the villain. It's funny, which is really
but when did he become a villain?
Was it the Gino Pat Summit spats?
Was it because the first 10 years when they win their first title in 95, he's not the villain. He's a young upstart from Philly. So the point I'm making is that certainly he's been turned into a villain and he's played into it in some of his press conferences, but for a lot of these franchises, there is no moment that you can point to, like the Yankees. Can we point to a moment where all of a sudden we realize they have spilled over and hit the turning point of villain?
The
Yankees?
Or any villain besides like Duke, I know we can get into, and there's plenty there. With UConn and with some other like sports villains, I can't necessarily point to moments. They sort of over time just become those to us.
Yeah, well, because it's the old Batman quote, right? Like, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And so you think about like, what is it about any of these things, right? It's like,
it's victory.
Hey, they're new, they're fun, they won. Wow, that's cool. Hey, wait, they won again. Wait, they won another one? Are they gonna just keep winning? Is anyone gonna stop these people from winning? That's the evolution.
Or something happens. Or if you're the New England Patriots, you get accused of cheating. Not once, but twice.
Several times.
You get Spygate, and then all of a sudden people start to look at you.
You're caught and convicted of cheating several times.
And then, of course, there's the Tuck rule. The Tuck rule is more the moment that turns you into the star, that turns you into the dynasty, because everything changes without that. I mean, if you're the Yankees, you're in New York, period. And you just keep winning and winning and winning, and you're just breaking hearts left and right. Every generation has a story of the Yankees breaking your heart. So it's not exactly, that's the evolutionary heel turn. The Raiders, they leaned into it. The Pistons, they leaned into it. That was personality based. But the Detroit Pistons aren't villains today. That period of team was the villain. But what I find really fascinating about it in UConn's case is that UConn is the first real dynasty to me. And maybe it's just simply because the way that I articulated it, I don't know. But everybody has been accepting over time that this is how it works in every sport. And now finally that you have South Carolina with, Don Staley, you've got, Baylor had a good run. You've got, Stanford's a good team. You've got other teams out there. Notre Dame won a championship. I don't necessarily hear people looking at UConn as villainous, which is actually sort of funny that they were sort of an underdog this year, and they were still a 2 seed. And I just sort of felt like watching them this year, was it me, or was it simply the fact that because I don't think a lot of people thought they were going to win a championship. Is that what sort of softened it? Or if they go back out and run the table next year, we're back to UConn being the bad guys?
So this is an interesting concept, Howard, because one of the teams that we haven't mentioned that makes me think of what you just said, there's the Dallas Cowboys. Where the Dallas Cowboys were the villains, and they were very successful, and that success is a long way away from now. But yet, we still hate them. They still occupy the villain role, and why
America's
is that?
Team.
Because there's still that element of almost like old kind of fables told from generation to generation. Don't let that evil rise up again.
And one day they'll be back. Mm-hmm. Exactly. One day the Cowboys will be back.
We have to stay vigilant to not allow this to come back.
We have to stay vigilant. And by the way, for the record, the Dallas Cowboys have not only not won a Super Bowl since 1995, they haven't even been to the NFC title game. That's 27 years. Two
playoff wins, is it? Since 1995, something along those lines. But so I think about UConn, and I think, I would argue that they were the villain, because again, on Basketball Illuminati, we talked about this, Kate, about the fact that they got to host a regional in Bridgeport despite not being the 1 seed. And kind of the implicit bias within that decision making. And if we don't have to rehash it, just go listen to Basketball Illuminati. from last, was that March 29th or whatever.
Crossover episode with Off the Looking Glass.
There
if
you
we're
go,
going to properly pitch our pods.
Hey, man, we're all
brand.
So I would argue, even though they entered that game as the underdog, they still kind of carried their asshole flag pretty far into this tournament experience. If they don't return to the level that we have become accustomed to seeing them at, I don't think the villainous part goes away. As long as Gino's there, they're like the Cowboys. They will be a fable passed from generation to generation.
And Belichick falls into that as well, you would think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, you're definitely right. Because I can imagine a generation from now, if there's parity in the women's college game, you still walk onto the court and you see you're playing UConn. There was still some sort of internal tremor of fear that would be like generationally passed down. But I mean, another, and a part of your Batman quote, and I guess I'm like the Marvel novice of all of us, but
it's a DC movie.
It's DC.
Yeah, whatever. Isn't that all the same thing? It's just, they're synonymous, right? I just say Marvel and you know what I mean? Animated things. But like for UConn, for me, what started to happen, and I think you saw some of it this year, is like, okay, you definitely brought women's basketball to a new level. Now you're staying too long in that spot, right? Like there's this moment that you're alluding to in the Elite Eight where NC State has put together a top 5 team this year, and going to the Final Four is a huge moment that has ripple effects. You can recruit better. You get more media coverage.
More money.
You get more, well, not actual money in women's sports pockets, but other men's teams would get money in their pocket. But yes, like theoretical money. And UConn, even though North Carolina State has had the better season, UConn gets to play on their home floor and wins in double OT. So you peel back and you're like, probably on a neutral site, NC State's going to the Final Four. So there's like, UConn's taking this villain turn because it's like, you've done great things for our universe and you've grown what you need to grow, but now you're muscling people out whose turn it is. And that is like another form of villainy.
Yeah, is it a turn? I mean, I sort of love that idea. I think it was in the 60s, there was a great talk about that with Bob Gibson, that in 1964, when the Cardinals played the Yankees, you realized, oh my God, he's coming. This guy, we're going to have to watch out for him for years. By 67, 68, now you're not just facing Bob Gibson, the pitcher. Now you're facing Bob Gibson and his aura as well. And that's what UConn still has. They've got so you're not playing against Diana Taurasi and Sue Birdham. You're playing the aura as well of UConn. And that, to me, brings me to this point. I love dynasties for this reason. How do we feel about dynasties? Like, Kate, you're saying, let somebody else play. This is their moment. You guys have been doing this for forever. To me, that sort of makes it even sweeter when you finally get them. Like in 99, Red Sox, Yankees, ALCS. And here the Red Sox look like they're going to win. Yeah, I think it was game 1. And then a ground ball goes off somebody's glove and a 2-1 game becomes 3. How do they do it every single year? Why is this happening? Why are you guys winning all the time when these fluke things seem to happen to you? It's like before the junior skyhook game in '87, right? I mean, how does the Lakers get an extra possession? It's just crazy that this is how. But this is what the dynasty gets. So to me, I sort of love that because I feel like in the NFL now, and they've gone so hard toward parity. If I don't have a team I'm circling, I lose interest. Yeah. I need UConn to be good because then I need the other teams to want to take them down. And when you slay the giant, that's news. I love watching that.
Yeah. Well, I don't think, and it's a nuanced point, especially in women's basketball, where it's like, I don't want UConn to be worse. I don't think UConn is bad. I just think that they have hit what I call warp speed, right? Which is, it has a direct parallel to like everyday life in America, where if you reach warp speed, you've reached this point where now you have so much money, you can hire the right tax attorneys to keep you from paying taxes to make even more money, and you're in warp speed.
Yeah.
And to get you out of warp speed, it's like kind of impossible once you've reached it. And that to me is like an interesting part of Dynasties is, and to your point, Howard, like part of what becomes so intriguing about them is that you know you're not just beating a team, you're beating an entire era because these teams reflect their era. So it's like NC State, right? They were good enough to beat UConn, but they weren't good enough to beat UConn, the dynasty, the era with warp speed, with everything that has come to it. So it's like in every, I assume, Marvel movie, it's like you can't just beat them on neutral ground. You have to like beat the whole energy of them. Yeah. And that is fascinating, but it's also frustrating because it happens 5 years later than it should because you're battling all of these other factors.
Yeah, don't you have to as well? I mean, you have to have that moment where the dynasty hits its tipping point, and then you go away, and then you come back. UCLA goes away in 75. Mm-hmm. They reach the title game in 80. They don't win another championship or even get back until 95, and now UCLA is not really UCLA anymore. They're kind of good this year. Mm-hmm. But then you've got some of the other ones. Like Kentucky has essentially been a good basketball team for 60 years. They haven't always been a title contender per se, but the aura of Kentucky has survived half a century. And ditto for North Carolina, even when they've been down. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens to Duke post Krzyzewski. Kansas, very good example of this as well, that they've become, instead of being the dynasty villain, Kansas is now sort of in that blue chip category. They're like the IBM stock, you know, where they're always kind of good. They're always very good, but they're not necessarily hated anymore. They're just venerable. They're at the top of the sport. Well, I wonder if UConn's going to do that at some point as well.
Well, Kansas, while one of the most decorated schools, are kind of like the San Antonio Spurs. Like, you never had that era of like 4 Final Fours in a row or 2 national championships.
That's right.
They never have that. And so that's what keeps them, I guess, somewhat likable, whatever you want to call.
Yep. And the one big year where they won, they weren't supposed to, in the Danny Manning team.
Yep, right. Danny and the Miracles. So, I mean, literally, the Miracles are in their name.
There we go.
But, you know, to go back to kind of dynasties and why they're important. Dynasties aren't for us. They're not. They're not for us that watch the sport and, you know, or live with it day to day. And whoever's in, Howard, I imagine for you, whoever's in the World Series, you're watching the World Series. The dynasties are for the casuals. It's for, so someone can look up and be like, huh, yeah, I've heard of them. I'll give you a great example. It was it was last year. It was during the 2021 playoffs, and I'm watching the game, and my 11-year-old walks in and says, what's this at NBA playoffs? And my 11-year-old stares at the screen and says, where's Klay Thompson? Because for my children,
that's basketball.
That's basketball. It's Steph Curry, it's Klay Thompson, it's Kevin. They still don't know his last name. I think they get him confused with Kevin Love. But it's and LeBron, right? Like, those are the characters. And if those characters aren't on my TV, then who are these guys, right? And so the dynasty makes it for someone who has the sensibilities of my 11-year-old, kind of like sports, and doesn't really care that much, to have like a homing device to be like, yes, I am centered. I know that character. I know this person. Oh, he's new. What's his story? That's what they exist for in terms of the massive casual fan attention that we need in order to be built into a popular sport. The other side of it was what Howard mentioned, and what I wanted to say earlier, and I forgot that I had 2 points, is the dynasties are the bar that makes everybody else be better. When Kevin Durant signed with the Warriors, the first initial reaction was, oh my God, no one's ever going to win anything ever again, right? These guys are just going to win every single thing that means something. And what ended up happening was Daryl Morey doubled down, and he traded for Chris Paul, and you see this ripple effect of teams after that initial shock saying, we got to be a whole lot better if we're going to beat them. We've got to do more if we're going to beat them. And I think that also lifts the quality and the caliber of play and gives us more compelling basketball games or sports in general.
Yeah. Going back to something you said, Howard, you were just casually tossing out the rhetorical question, I think, of like, now that Coach K is gone at Duke, what happens? Like, then the question pops into my mind of, is Duke even capable of a rebrand? Because I feel like their villainy is just so deeply embedded in American culture, in location, in privilege versus in class versus like other villains that we've had, as we've outlined on this podcast, aren't that deeply embedded as villains. Sorry, Amin, go ahead.
So I'm gonna jump in real quick. The difference between Duke and almost every other villain that we talk about, other than the New York Yankees, is that it's about where they're from. Duke isn't just some school in the South. Kentucky, as you mentioned, and North Carolina, there's all of them. But Duke is the private school in the South where you drive around campus and all you see are luxury cars with New Jersey license plates.
Right.
These are people who are not from here. They're rich kids from the North who come down here and think they're better than everybody else, particularly all the public school kids at North Carolina State. Now, the irony, of course, is those are both really good academic schools as well. It's not like, this is...
And even worse when the rich kids are whooping ass on you.
Yes.
On the basketball court. There's the insult to injury. Worse, the storyline is supposed to be that you get your comeuppance. Rich boy,
right.
Yes,
but not with them.
Nope, they do the opposite. They're the jock, the popular jock, big man on campus who ends up winning. Winning at the end and keeps the girl and gets straight A's. And meanwhile, our hero, which would be, I guess, whatever public school they're playing against, whether it's Michigan, whether it's North Carolina,
is calling timeout in a championship game.
Yep.
Yeah, because it seems like there are villains that are very distinctly ephemeral in some way. Like I don't think of Detroit necessarily. I think of it as a blue collar city with all of the things we would say about Detroit, which made the bad boys make sense, but they're not necessarily like villains that are baked into an era that represent an era. Whereas I feel like the Yankees are a reflection of an era, and I feel like Duke is a reflection both of a place and an era, which is taking its villainy to other levels.
I think the Yankees are of a place too. A lot of people in this country do not like New York and what it represents. It represents, again, these people in the South. Like it represents all these loudmouths who moved from up there down here, telling us how everything here is worse and New York's got everything better. There's a huge anti-New York.
And if you can't make it here, you have to be able to make it here, or you're nothing. Maybe I don't want to live there.
Litmus test. It's the
exactly.
Litmus
Maybe
test.
I want nothing to do with you. Well, if you can't play in New York, you got to be able to play in New York. Maybe I don't like your town. You ever consider that? Maybe I'm very happy where I am. No.
If your bakery is not good enough to sell cupcakes in New York City, those are some shitty cupcakes.
You call this a bagel?
That's right.
So I'm trying to think of the other geographic kind of like it's
L.A. Beat L.A.
Yes.
Los Angeles, no question.
Hollywood. They don't care about their sports. They're surfing. They show up late to the games. They leave early. Like all of these tropes we have about
and
LA
it's
sports.
really, really sunny all the time there, and it's 19 degrees out my window. I hate these people.
Why do they get to live in an awesome weather place and get good teams? Right?
That's right.
And Hollywood stars and everyone's beautiful in the crowd and all that. This might be completely off topic, but when you mentioned Montreal and Boston in hockey, Howard, I thought of what, in my estimation, is still the greatest pregame intro I've ever seen, which is the Canadiens versus Bruins in the playoffs, and they lower the lights, and this is when they first started doing that projection onto the ice, and it said like 1919 4-1, 1925 4, and I'm like, what's going on? Then I realized, oh my God, this is all the times they've beaten them in the playoffs. They're just throwing them out there one by one, and it just made me think about that when you guys are talking about you're not playing them. You're playing all the ghosts that are up there that are coming down.
Celtic pride. It was the same thing. It's that you come into Boston Garden and all of a sudden you're not going to win. And then what made it worse were the number of teams that folded when they got there. I mean, that was what was really interesting. I remember talking to, and that is sort of the thing that makes people hate you. Like that there is something preordained about coming here, and that, we come in here with the best intentions. We're the better team, and somehow you walked away with a win. How did we lose? because you're not just playing this team, you're playing all of it, which is why the dreaded Curt Schilling still had one of the best lines in the 2001 World Series, where somebody asked him about, how are you going to contend against the aura and mystique of the New York Yankees? And Schilling said, aura and mystique sound like two strippers at the strip club, something like that.
Wow, that really maps onto him very well.
Right? He said, aura and mystique, they sound like that they work at the strip club. And then Schilling went out and beat him. And so that was the other piece that made that. It would have been like a really interesting line, and then if had the Yankees won, it would have been a throwaway line. But then he actually went out and walked the walk as well.
To give you guys a personal example of that, obviously when I worked in Phoenix for the Suns, we had many a foible with the Spurs, and it always was something supernatural. Whether Tim Duncan hitting a three-pointer, even though he didn't attempt one all season long, but he's going to make that one. Robert Horry hit
Robert Horry.
And the suspension and everything about them always screamed like there was always another shoe that was waiting to drop. So in 2010, we go and play them, and we win the first two games. And then we go and we win game 3, and Goran Dragic has an amazing fourth quarter to lead us there. And then in game 4, Steve Nash gets hit in the eye, and he has to come out to get stitches. And I swear to you, we're up 3-0 in this series, and we're up double digits when it happened. They hit 2 3-pointers. We called timeout, and in my head, I said, "This is how it happens. This is how we become the first team to ever lose a 3-0 lead in the NBA playoffs, because this building is haunted. It just has all the memories of all the bullshit they ever pulled throughout the years just came crashing down on me." Thank God I didn't say anything out loud. But in my head, I was like, here we go. All right, what you got for us this time, Pop?
Yeah, well, here's the beauty of the Dynasty as well. I actually love that as part of the narrative and part of the storyline, because now you are competing against that, because if you're thinking about it, the players are thinking about it too. They're all thinking, is this the moment that puts us back where we lose again? Is this the moment that steals the momentum? You go back to 1981, Celtics up down 3-1 on the 76ers. They win 3 in a row out of nowhere. The very next year, it happens again.
And even when, Curt Schilling says the thing about, aura and destiny sounding like stripper names, as if these things are nebulous, right? Like they're all in your mind. Obviously, to some degree that is true, but from a very specific story at UConn, like I went and coached summer camp in college at UConn. And after camp, you'd play pickup with all the UConn players, and this was Bird, Taurasi, Swin Cash days. And it's the only time this has ever happened to me playing pickup with other college players, is we dropped one of the UConn team. All 5 UConn players had to drop a player because she had to go to night class. And UConn, that pickup team was like, oh, we don't need a 5th. Right? Like, we will continue playing this game 5-on-4. So, and like, to me in that moment, what it said was...
Wait a
shade
second.
right
Wait
there.
a goddamn second. You're playing pickup, and then somebody had to leave, and rather than just say, oh, we'll go to 4s or something like that, they said, no, we'll keep playing 4-on-5.
And this is, like, my squad that I'm playing with is all 5 Division I players, like a collection of Division I players. They're all 5 UConn. They have to. My point being that when you are a dynasty, you actually go about programming these, these like kind of like whatever we call aura and destiny.
No, you
actually have reached a place where you are actually practicing what that is and what that looks like. At Colorado, when I was playing, we never tried to play 5-on-4, right? We were just trying to be the best we could at 5. We hadn't gotten to the level where we were like, now we're so good, let's beat teams with 1 fewer player. And so when you step on the court against a UConn or whomever, like, aura and destiny feel like non-tangible things, but they get practiced in very tangible ways.
Well, here's the one thing to consider, though. You're 100% right about that, Kate, except for this. Okay, let's go 99.9. And then here's the 0.1%.
Okay, here's the exception, yeah.
The exception is the implicit bias. When you start getting calls because you're the dynasty, there is another piece to this that it's like, okay, I'm going up against, destiny and mystique, and, I'm going up against, this is
and
in
so
my
is the
head.
ref.
Exactly. But then They're the calls that these guys are suddenly getting because they're the Celtics, or that they're the Patriots, or that they're the Lakers. And that all of a sudden that LeBron hasn't, he had 3 fouls in the first quarter, has played exactly the same physical game and hasn't had a foul called on him for the last 45 minutes.
One other element that is obvious but should be mentioned about why we hate dynasties is don't they just feel gluttonous? Like, don't you start to feel like Boston fans, like, you can't possibly appreciate what you have compared to how Amin would have felt if the Suns had won, one NBA title during his tenure. Like, there's an element of like diminishing returns. Like, you 100%. Don't need
spoiled ass fan bases. Like, like when in 04, there was that, well, what do we do now after the Red Sox won the World Series? So they win it again in 07, then they win it again in 2013, and now they've turned into everything all the contempt that they had for the Yankees, they've become them. Yes. Oh, we just win all the time. I'm like, really? And like this place, it's really interesting. When you grow up in Boston, we were the Celtics. That was it. Everybody else lost. If you're the Patriots, you finally get to a championship, you get demolished by the Bears. You're the Red Sox, you're known for just losing everything at the end. You're the Bruins, you hadn't won a Stanley Cup since 72, and you are constantly being humiliated by the Montreal Canadiens. If you're the Patriots, you'd never beaten the Dolphins on the road. And then all of a sudden, everybody's winning. And Boston fans are insufferable.
Howard, I was going to ask you, as a father, how do you process that, where your childhood and your life as a sports fan is described with one word of misery? And
misery. My son was born in 2004, and one day I was looking at him, and I'm like, you don't know what defeat is. You don't lose.
All he knows is excellence.
All he knows is winning. That's it. I mean, in his lifetime, every one of those teams has won a championship.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I think it's a bit of a litmus test for what kind of, person you are. I had a mom who grew up in Rhode Island, and her whole side of the family, huge Red Sox fans. I don't think I would ever want my team to be a dynasty. I would rather be in a steady state of pursuit, because the steady state of pursuit is compelling. Yeah. And I don't find if my team is a dynasty. Now, I love dynasties if I'm the Red Sox and I'm constantly chasing them for 100 years. But I don't know, Amin, you're the dynasty? You want your team to be the dynasty?
No, I said, then I've got a team for you. You've got to be a New York football
Knicks.
Dynasty.
Your team.
Football, no. No. Because you don't want to be the Knicks. If you're the Knicks, you're in constant pursuit, but you never get it. You are pushing up the boulder up the hill and never getting to the top. The Giants, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a lifelong Giants fan, and they are the team that's given me the most happiness in my life for one reason only. They're not good all the time. They don't give me the pressure of needing They've got one in the 80s, one in the 90s, one in the 2000s, one in the 2010s. If you give me one Super Bowl a decade, I don't care what you do in the middle. I'm happy because I can
say they've got 4 titles. That's right.
4.
Yeah. I forgot. They beat Buffalo. Yeah. And it's interesting because as much as we have, and when you were talking about the ESPN UConn bias, when you live out in California, when I lived out in San Francisco, they always referred to it as East Coast bias.
East Coast bias.
It's like all of you guys over here get this dispensation because all of you are dynasties in some way compared to us because you get all the coverage. But as much as we talk about the Boston Celtics, there is one dynasty in the NBA right now. It's the Lakers. I mean, if you look at what the Los Angeles Lakers have done in the from 1980 on, they have dominated the NBA. Mm-hmm. And they are everything. They are the sport because they get something that Boston has never gotten, which is free agent destination. Everybody wants to go there too. So they get, not only do they have the team, not only do they have the squad, not only do they have the Hall of Famers, not only do they have, they've got the geography as well. So watching them fall out of the 10 seed, there is a bit of haterade going on there too. It's like, okay. And also having LeBron go there. And that was the last sort of question here, is it, does the dynasty, does the hatred of the dynasty, does it bring out the worst in us as well as fans? Because to me, I've never understood the rooting against. If my team's not in it, what value do I have? What do I get out of watching Duke lose to Carolina?
Well, that's what the Miami guys talk about. They said when the decision happened, they knew they were going to get it bad in Cleveland, right? They knew they were going to get it bad in New York. They knew they were going to get bad even in Boston as a traditional rival. It was like what they were confused by is we're in Memphis getting booed like crazy. Like what you got? We don't even play in the same conference.
Us now.
Why?
Yeah.
Why does Utah care so much that what happened? But again, that's the sign of a great villain. Where it's not just rivals that hate you, it's everybody.
Everybody hates you.
Yeah. I mean, it is much easier to figure out who you hate than to figure out who you love. I mean,
Yep.
like it is that triggers. I mean, as we've seen over the last 10 years in America, like it is much easier to figure out that piece of it than like the nuance of like, what do I like about the Jazz? Let me see.
All right, last question, speed round. Which dynasty are we happy exists in terms of just for the compelling nature of the sport that we need them, or do we just not need any of them?
Yeah. Well, seems counterintuitive, but I am very happy UConn exists, especially now that we're in a place where not only do they exist, but there's people not only chomping at their heels, but able to consistently beat them. Because I feel like then we have both things we need. We have the dynasty that gives you the automatic storyline Amin is talking about, but we don't have what we had 10 years ago, which is like a 32-point blowout in the NCAA title game. So like UConn right now, I'm happy with where we are. If we could have them for another 5 to 7 years to be that push-pull as the sport grows, I think that's a very good place for it to be.
Amin.
Is it okay if we call Serena Williams, the Williams sisters, a dynasty? Is that am I going too far by going into individual sports?
It counts.
I think about the impact that they've had on the sport in terms of encouraging young women all over the world, really, and particularly young women of color to be involved in tennis. I think ideally, to me, that's what a dynasty exists for. It exists to teach a new generation, hey, you want to do this too.
To build it all.
Yeah, the biggest thing the 92 Olympic team did, and I guess if you want to call the USA basketball a dynasty, the biggest thing they did was inspire everybody by showing them the bar's here, come meet me there. And within, 12 years of the Dream Team, or no, 10 years, 2002. Within 10 years, USA basketball with NBA players was defeated on USA soil, no less. And so to me, I think, when I think about the Williams sisters and, they were obviously the epitome of you either loved them or hated them. I think the best thing they did was inspire so many others after them. So that's my pick of the dynasty that I hope keeps going, even though it's kind of limited, right?
Yeah, well, Venus is 41 and Serena's going to be 41 this year. So I think that ship is pretty much sailing. For me, I got to tell you, I'm going to go, I don't like to split it, but I miss the Montreal Canadiens. I do.
Oh, really?
I miss the fact that they're just another team. The Green Bay Packers came back. The Cowboys may one day come back. The Celtics had a little moment, with the big three where they came back. The Lakers are sort of
now.
Always, and then they might be back here now, but you need that. But that one, those guys never came back. They're just another team. The Canadiens haven't been to a Stanley Cup since they went to the Stanley Cup. They haven't won it since 93. And I sort of like having that team that your team can't beat. And when you go up there and actually win a game, it really means something. And I'm going to say, and finally, I don't feel like the rest of the country shares this, but I'm kind of hoping that the Patriots stick around for a little bit as well, just because it's kind of fun to watch everybody hate on them. But without Brady, I don't know if it's the same. And that's the Krzyzewski piece of this too. Is Duke still going to feel like Duke without him, to your point about Geno? And there we go. That, folks, is a wrap. We'll see you next week on another Meadowlarkers. Be good, y'all.